Buonasera a tutti, buonasera.
Good evening to you all.
Buonasera e benvenuti a GiovedìScienza.
Good evening and welcome to GiovedìScienza Science on a Thursday. We're going to be talking about a problem which was underestimated and has been underestimated for a long time, avoided by the media, newspapers, and the media have ignored it. Only recently have they started focusing on it. It's what our guest calls the population unease. It starts with a good reason because life expectancy and average age has increased. This is good news. But at the same time, we have also witnessed a drop in births, which is why in Italy in particular, we are witnessing the fact that the population is aging. And this also entails a number of problems which we will be discussing with our guests. So I'm going to introduce him, Antonio Golini.
Antonio Golini è un demografo, il più autorevole.
Antonio Golini is a population expert, the most important. It's our responsibility. He denies it, but he is the most important demographer in Italy, teaches it, and Luis, and he is an emeritus at the Sapienza and has also led a number of committees on this study. He has been dealing with this problem for many a year. I'd like to give him the floor so that he can debate what the situation is and what possible solutions there are.
È un grande piacere essere qui.
It is a great pleasure for me to be here, and amongst other things, one of my sons and granddaughters live here, and I have many dear friends who are here, and I thank them very much for having come. It is something which is self-evident that a population which wishes to remain unchanged over time, that is to say, the size of the population and its breakdown by age and sex, I was saying, it is self-evident that it has to be stationary, as we say technically. That is to say, over the long time, it must not be growing indefinitely, nor must it be decreasing, because it is in it being stable or steady, you have its features and its breakdown remain the same, which is why it is easier from a social and economic point of view to meet expectations and to maintain the infrastructure that is needed for the population.
Allora, dicevamo, ammontare.
So, as I was saying, number and breakdown by age and sex. As far as the breakdown by sex, so the situation is quite good in that at birth there are more boys than girls, about 106 over for every 100. And this greater number of boys is progressively rebalanced because of male supermortality, meaning that we are the real weak sex, and therefore at every age of our lives, the likelihood of dying for a boy is greater than that for a woman. In fact, I think we have all experienced the fact that there are many more widows than widowers. The age breakdown is the one that feels the impact of death rates and of fertility. On the one hand, greater life expectancy means that a larger number of newborn get to 80 and 90. I am one of them, for instance, and that we become more and more frail, which was unimaginable till not so long ago. These very long-living newborn come from the births that for many years in Italy were about 1 million a year. Now in Italy there are under 500,000 a year. This is the reason why I wrote this booklet, which is called Italian Far and Few Apart, as I disagree with the mic here. But I've been quarreling with technology. In any case, we have a large number of elderly and very elderly people that are the outcome of the births of the past, and with a very small number of children. Somebody might suggest that there is no problem. What's the problem of the fact that the average population is aging? The problem is also in the type of economic organization which is the basis of our production and pension systems and globalization. As far as the productive system is concerned, needless to remind that once the many children that there were and the few elderly people also contributed to the productive system, which was based mainly on agriculture, with work that was very limited, but were very important from a social point of view. Nowadays, where now that education and training have been extended, and also retirement has been extended, following Bismarck's revolution, we have to rethink. In fact, it was Bismarck, faced with the Industrial Revolution, introduced a pension system as we know it today. And I was talking about Bismarck's revolution and the impact that it has on our lives and on the productive system. The Industrial Revolution also introduced a clear time division. In fact, this revolution was also accompanied by a revolution of the family, which is why at one time, when my father was a young man, you only had one family, the family of origin, but you also only had one family throughout your lives. Now we know that even families break down and remade and reorganize. This was a revolution in the life cycle of people, and this is very different. We have time spans now, education, work or productive period, and then long retirement. This changes a balance that we'd had for 200 years, roughly. And this means that the expenditure for education and then for retirement have to be paid for by the middle segment, that is to say, the productive one. But now they've increased year by year, which means that the people who are in the productive segment have to pay more tax. This has to be said because non-specialists believe that you're paying your own. No, the ones who work are the ones who pay for everyone. This revolution, this economic and social revolution, is now breaking under the weight of the demographic revolution or the population bomb, which has changed the balance between productive and reproductive people. Normally, people don't think, but it is important because a smaller number of babies means that 25 years later, there are going to be fewer people who can reproduce, and this triggers a vicious circle which will create the risk that the population decline, an extended population decline, will lead to a social and economic decline, and the outcome of which is not entirely foreseeable. As far as the decline in the numbers of the labor force, it can be counteracted favoring immigration. And in the light of what has been said, for us in Italy is convenient and in fact a necessary condition. But this emigration, and I would like to stress once again, a necessary thing, has to be first of all accepted, and then integration has to take place. And it also has to be regulated. While the social and political conditions of our country do not appear to favor this type of solution, on the other hand, we should consider also the quality, that is to say, that this immigration may not be able to satisfy the offer of jobs. On the other hand, this smaller number of births might in the long term lead to an advantage, considering that all the technology is increasingly labor saving. That is to say, there are fewer people needed to run it. And I think that this mismatch between a growing social need and a decrease in births might be dealt with an increasing share of voluntary work, charity work, and solidarity. From various points of view, economic, financial, and employment, cultural point of view, and family point of view, everybody should have the duty and also feel the pleasure of supporting those who need. In Italy, voluntary work and charity and solidarity are values that are widespread and quite general. We all have to do everything we can so that not only should we not lose such values, but also that they should be enhanced, especially in large cities. In the small towns, they work very well, but the problems are more in the large cities, where there is less voluntary and charity work. We have to endeavor so that there should be behavior of wholehearted solidarity. Then there's the problem of globalization and of the growing international competition. This too, to deal with a population trend, which especially in Africa is an upward trend, and deal with the process of globalization. Certainly, a small and aging population may not survive. This is why I called my book Italians few and far apart, Italiani poca gente, because this is what happens. And following this brief introduction, I wanted to say what I imagined in the text. Thank you very much.
Dunque, noi abbiamo un'Italia che ha questo primato,
we have an Italy that has this record, which is not really enviable, that is to say, as that of a country that is aging. Now there's Japan, I think, that beats us, but in Europe, is rather than, we should say, rather than being an old continent, we should say a continent of old people. But this is not what's happening in the world. The population is growing, although the growth rate is slowing down. Now I would like to ask Professor Golini if in the history of Homo sapiens things were different. That is to say, if I'm not mistaken, there were two moments of the demographic transition of jumps, so to speak, from the agricultural revolution onwards. Nice question. Well, a summary, please.
Dal punto di vista biologico,
from a biological point of view, humanity has a great ability to grow. This ability to grow in history has been reduced due to the effect of its limited ability to create resources or generate resources to match growth. So, for instance, we had a very early mortality rate that was very high, and then what happened, two people arrived, two very emblematic people, that is to say, Jenner and Pincus. Jenner contributed in a decisive way to control early mortality, and he predates Pincus by 150 years roughly, and Pincus helped to control births. So maybe Jenner is the person who in fact invented vaccines. And please excuse me, I should have said it. The fact that Jenner predated Pincus by 150 years has meant that we reduced mortality drastically before we were able to reduce fertility, and in this intervening time there was what some experts, especially American experts, called the baby boom. Nowadays, the contraceptive pill is widespread, they're easily accessible, they're cheap and safe. And given that they're easy, cheap and safe, they're very widespread, and therefore fertility has dropped very much, reaching levels that, in my opinion, is worrying, because it's very far from ensuring the continuity of generations. Today in Italy we have about 13 births for every 20 parents, so it is quite self-evident that if there are only 13, that in the cycle of generations will replace 20 adults, well, the population will age and shrink because mortality decreases and it is not replaced. One objection that can certainly be naive, which is what you say, well, in a country where there are lots of us, what's the problem if we stop and we don't increase our numbers? Well, the problem, yes, you mentioned it. The problem is that, one, we no longer ensure the continuity of generations, and therefore, from the point of view of biology and demography, there is a decline in the population, and this in itself would not be particularly bad were it not for the fact that this decline in the population and this marked drop in births is extended over time and widespread. And we all understand that if there is an extended lack of births over the long period of time, the population will disappear. Some people might say there's more than 7 billion of us. So what's the problem if a small population like the Italian one disappears? Well, I'd be sorry about that. Why? Because from a demographic point of view, if there are more or fewer people, considering the large numbers, it's not too bad. But from a cultural point of view, there is a problem, and it's bad. Think of the Italian culture and what the Italian culture has given over centuries, and also think of the extraordinary value of, for example, the Italian cuisine. And so to see its disappearance is something which I think would be a big problem, not just for us but as Italians, but for the entire world. On the other hand, we try to work to survive and to also work for the survival of animal species, because we believe that the variety of animal species is a value for the whole world, and therefore I don't understand why we are not as worried for the fact that we as civilizations are disappearing, we Italians. Yes, you're also saying let's defend Parmesan, but we basically are not defending Italian culture as a whole. Yes, that's exactly what I think.
Ma dunque,
there's another objection that could be made, which is not quite as naive, but should be dealt with. And it's not just the fact that Italy will disappear and that its culture will go down the drain, but that in a world that is overpopulated. So the final balance is that we don't grow too much, but in fact that might be all right. But even if we imagine a steady number or a steady ratio in the population, deaths and births, the ideal situation is that this should happen also within each country, because if births exceed deaths, or countries like Italy where the opposite happens, there might be rivalry and unbalances both within countries and among countries and among generations. Yes, that's what I think happens. I think this is what happens. And sub-Saharan Africa has an especially big growth, and Southern Europe has a decrease in the population, which is quite marked. If we look at a map of the world, an atlas, we are partly saved by the Sahara and the Mediterranean, because these are two hurdles in the route from Central Africa to Europe. And therefore, we have to thank the Sahara and the Mediterranean if the flow of migrants from Africa, from Central and Southern Africa, is relatively small. But the situation is what it is. We have to sadly thank the Mediterranean and the Sahara. Why was the problem disregarded, ignored by the media for such a long time? And in fact, people were talking about the opposite problem, that is to say, about the population bomb and the overuse of the planet. What happened? Were these forecasts wrong? The country that best in Europe deals with the population problem is France, where the number of births matches the French population. It's a replacement ratio, and it's much better than the Italian ones. The interpretation that many of us give is that France had 3 population and social shocks, and 3 military ones. The Germans arrived in Paris 3 times, and especially the first time there was an awareness by the French on the fact that there weren't enough births, and its malaise. Shall I talk about a population malaise? This meant that in France, children, newborns, are seen as a collective good. That is to counteract the decline in the population and on the defeats that France had against Germany. And if a child is seen as a collective good and not only as an individual one, I think that's a big advantage for everyone. Also because to have an average of 2 children per couple, it's instinctive to understand that since there are people who don't want or can't have children, there has to be the same number of couples that have 4. If we want to stick to the 2, the replacement ratio, and a certain number of couples or women can only have 1. So you need a certain number to have 3. Now, have 3 or 4 children. I'm smiling because I have a colleague here who has had lots and lots of children, but his motivations were very different from the usual ones. But 3 or 4 children is very difficult nowadays, and therefore we don't offset the number of couples who have 0 or 1 child. You mean just as we guarantee the freedom to not have children, we should also see the freedom of having many children? Well, the ones you want. All the opinion polls that we carry out prove that women and couples would like, very often, would like to have 2 or 3 children, but then they don't have any or have 1, because the difficulties that there are in having 4 children, for instance, if not more, are so many, and therefore they can't match their aims or the ones which in your life or in our lives we have. So I was saying that the Italian society rightly gives the necessary freedom to couples who can't or don't want to have children, but does not ensure comparable economic and psychological help to the women and to the couples who wish to have 3 or 4. Yes, but why were they successful with this in France? What policies? Well, France, as I was mentioning, their defeat against Germany was attributed to the lack of young people. So a child, the birth of a child, acquired a social value which it hasn't got here. Yes, but what do they do in practice? What does the government do to guarantee this? What type of actions has the government undertaken? Because you said that in Italy we guarantee more electoral votes and therefore the objectives on the short term. So in the 70s we had terrorism, now we have an AOP strategy rather than being involved with parents who want children. Why? What type of encouragement is needed?
L'incoraggiamento
Well,
maggiore,
I think
secondo me, dovrebbe essere
there should be a cultural change. That is to say,
al neonato, ripeto,
I'm repeating now for the fourth or fifth time, that the newborn should have a social value, while currently a newborn is considered an individual person for a woman and for the couple, without any social value. It should, because in fact it is. It has a social value, but this is not perceived. Right. And as far as the possibility of working better and working more to aid or encourage more births, what could be done?
Vedo che la signora esprime, come dire, perplessità rispetto.
A member of the audience there is expressing her perplexity. You say something in your book, although it may not be the entire solution. Well, financial and economic contributions for birth should be extended at least for 20 years. That is to say, for all the time during which the young people are growing up, helping families to deal with the major expenses that there are in having a child. And then I once again would like to reiterate that if we fail to give back a social value to every newborn, you know, we still have in our minds, at least some of us, the impact of the fascist period, where newborns were important for the development and growth of fascism, while now I would like to say that newborns are necessary for survival. Right. You were also mentioning the improving the working conditions for women. Yes, it's a bit of a paradox. That is to say, where female work is more widespread, that is where fertility is higher. Here, the number of women at work is lower than it is in other developed countries, so we are faced with a lack of responsibility of couples and of the state in terms of reproduction. So in general, you think we should focus more on the collective aspect than the individual one? Yes, that is to say that having children should not be seen as an individual choice, but at least it should be a choice that affects everybody. Very often we don't realize how much this can influence the community as a whole. So we have to refocus on the individual. Yes, we should shift. In the book, I speak about two cases. One which concerns a meeting that some experts, myself included, had with King Baudouin in Belgium. At one point, King Baudouin said, there is a point of non-return? And I answered, good question, sir. And in fact, his officer standing behind him looked very badly, because kings can only ask good questions. A professor, and a foreign one at that, should tell the king good question. But the truth is that it was really a good question, because when the share of over 60s, that is to say, people who are no longer in a reproductive age, exceed 30% in the population, there is the risk of reaching a point of no return. And then the other case I would like to tell you about happened in a taxi that I took from the Linate airport into Milan, and that I shared with a young lawyer, a woman, who was also going into Milan. I was holding the documents that I was preparing for my meeting in Milan, and we ended up by talking about population trends. So I asked her, do you think it is the right that everybody has to limit and to space out births? And she said, well, of course it is. Everyone has the right to decide when and how many children they're going to have. And then I said, do you also think it is a duty to have children? And they looked at me in horror, both the lawyer and also the taxi driver, because in our general approach, there is no idea that having children also should be seen as a contribution to society. Well, since we're in a university here, and maybe there are a few students, let's talk about graduates, and I'm quoting from your book. You say even the fact that you graduated is worth less than in other industrialized countries, because in Italy there are not that many graduates, but we need even fewer. Are you speaking with our Prime Minister or with me? Are you speaking with a Prime Minister or with an expert? I'm talking to you. Well, the expert points out facts, imagines solutions, but then politically and socially, it's not my position or an expert's position to give solutions. You wrote that for many years now you've been trying to get politicians to focus on this, but you've always ended up against the brick wall. Well, some Greens considered me very reactionary. Many, many years ago, I was even accused of being a fascist because I was trying to draw their attention on the need to appreciate newborns as an essential
per lo sviluppo
ingredient of the population development and for development of culture and society. That is what it is. So be it. But slowly things are changing. The idea... Well, so you're an optimist. Because some people have realized, you mentioned a few companies, for instance, you were once contacted by Plasmon, the baby biscuit company. Yes, in the book I was talking about when I, but this goes to back many, many years, of when some managers from the Plasmon baby biscuit company came to me because they were very concerned about the drop in birth rate and therefore the reduction or shrinking of their market, because they made baby foods. So they asked me if I believed that there was the possibility to overturn tendency. I said no, and in fact that is what has happened. But that debate and my forecast, my negative forecast, led them to create the misura measure side, that's for adults to counterbalance in the market the declining number of newborns and therefore of their products. Now let's go back to other countries. Certainly the counter trend was China, and China made a choice, and that possibly is now paying for its choices, and the other one is India. Can you tell us something about what is happening and what has happened? In China made a major mistake with the so-called single child or one child policy. I don't know if you know that for a certain number of years in China, to try and slow down the population growth, they introduced a one-child policy. That is to say that each couple could have only one child and otherwise would incur in various fines, and there were also measures taken against the women and against the couple. The policy was very effective because it was very coercive, so it had to be effective, but in the long term, it has proved very negative because in this policy led to the fact that there was a deselection of girls because the Chinese wanted a boy, and so this widespread killing of girls or early abortions with girls led to more boys than girls, so much so that those boys who, once they reached their adult age, had to import women from Vietnam to be able to get married, given the lack of girls, and therefore a totally wrong policy. While in India, well, I remember that I took part in a meeting with President Rao, who gave 10 good reasons and told us experts to limit births in India and to increase contraception. And then at the end he said, well, if I were to speak at a conference of farmers instead of experts, I would not have the same success that I have here, because agriculture in India was and still is partly the main source of economic wealth, and in agriculture every birth is a success, a contribution, while the drop in the number of births will lead in a reduction of the labor force in agriculture and farming, and therefore to a decline in our overall economy. So, he said, were I to speak at a farmers' meeting, I would have to say something else, because certainly they would not take it. India, according to the forecast, will overtake China in terms of numbers in a few years. Yes, it should. Going back to Italy, it is clear that an aging country also has a problem of sustainability of the public spending. If public spending increases, and there are fewer people who contribute to this, but there's also a problem of productivity, because in terms of the labor force, we still have enough people, but what is missing is that there is both productivity shortage, or there's a lower productivity, and also there are not so many entrepreneurs. You continue to consider me as if I were the Prime Minister. If I had an answer on this, I wouldn't be here. Well, what is happening? On the one hand, as we were saying, technology is all aimed at saving labor. That is to say, it tends to reduce the number of people at work, and therefore job creation is very difficult. On the other hand, competition with demographically strong countries, and we were mentioning sub-Saharan Africa, is very intense, and I would like to reiterate thanks the Sahara and the Mediterranean if they limit people who come here, the numbers of people who come here, and therefore I feel that the only solution can be the one of a widespread solidarity, interpersonal solidarity, in that those who are better off in a financial, psychological, and physical point of view should help those who are worse off from all the points of view. And this solidarity, interpersonal solidarity, is something that I see is a very limited solution to the problems. I didn't mention it before, although I mentioned it in the sense that I referred to the book. This is the book that Professor Golini wrote with Marco Valerio Lopresti. It is virtually an interview where there are no questions and answers, but there is an ongoing flow of analysis and answers. No solutions, just general ideas. This is in Italian, Italiani Poca Gente, published by the Lewis, and talking about young people and productivity. The professor identifies, please correct me if I make a mistake, that is to say, the ability to progress, an entrepreneurial capability is stronger in young people. That is to say, young people are more creative, while those who have more experience, regardless of age, those who have more experience manages to have a better nous for business. So the two should go together. Italy, with a population which is aging, unfortunately, has come across this problem, because the elderly, the ones, continue to have positions of responsibility that could be taken over by youngsters. We have creative youngsters who have no opportunity to develop. Now, for example, let's take Silicon Valley and other countries. with successes and failures, but the key was that young people took on very important decision-making positions, which is why they implemented new decisions. But to implement creative ideas, in the end, youngsters over here tend to vote with their feet. This is not a political decision, but they just go. They leave, although there's a bit of rhetoric of the brain drain, because in this case, there were people who just study abroad, but numbers tell us that people, if we consider the balance between immigration and immigration, many of our youngsters leave. Yes.
Anche quelli intellettuali.
Migration, intellectually migration, are very positive in the sense that it is an exchange of experience which can only be fruitful both for the individual and for the collectivity. But this migration cannot be a mere loss or a pure loss of graduates who go to other countries. A graduate, amongst other things, costs very much in terms of training. We all pay for this, so it's a net loss, not only of human resource, but also of financial loss when graduates leave. But to make Italy an attractive country is very complicated. Yes, I'm an optimist. Allow me to close in thanking all the people who've come here. I was not expecting that a meeting that had as a topic the population trend should be so successful. And so, therefore, I'm very grateful to all those who came here, and I would like to give them a round of applause. Thank you. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antonio Golini. This is his book, and it's Italiani Poca Gente, Few and Far Apart. We will reconvene here next week, and we will be talking about veterinary science and the 250 years. It's older than the average Italian of the veterinary science faculty in Turin. See you next week.